Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, to remember to hit that subscribe button and to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, you can do that via our website where you find blog posts, updates, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And today's podcast is about the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, which formed part of the Overland Campaign in 1864. And of course, it is the 160th anniversary of those events this year. And of course, joining me today is co-founder of Emerging Civil War and an author of many Civil War books. It is none other than Chris Mackowski. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me back, Daz. It's always a pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. And of course, the Overland Campaign is 6 straight weeks of non-stop contact. And before we get into the actual Battle of Spotsylvania, can you just a quick overview of the Wilderness, because that's the first battle in that series of battles, isn't it, Chris?
Sure. So the spring campaign opens up, and really Grant, who's the general-in-chief of the armies, he's going to move all U.S. armies around at the same time, including the Army of the Potomac, which he's going to travel with. They're going to push through the area known as the Wilderness, which is 70 square miles of Virginia frontier, toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, with the idea of kind of getting around Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And from there, Grant wants to try to lure Lee out into an open field battle and use his superior numbers to overwhelm Lee with a knockout blow. The election of 64 is coming up in the fall, and so Lincoln really needs the stalemate of the war to shake up, and so he's really counting on Grant to do something that's going to change the political landscape. Otherwise, Lincoln's afraid he's not going to get reelected. So Grant's got these 120,000 guys. He wants to just start clobbering Lee, who's only got about 66,000 guys. But he says if by no other means than attrition, he's simply going to wear the Confederates out. Hopefully he can get that annihilation rather than just attrition. But he's got a couple different ways that he's going to approach this. So as he's heading towards Spotsylvania, Robert E. Lee actually comes out and meets him in the Wilderness. And engages Grant in battle, who is quick to engage because he's looking for that fight. But the Wilderness, being a second growth deciduous jungle, really negates Grant's numerical superiority. And so they're going to fight for a couple days there. And Grant's going to be like, you know what, this isn't working. I'm not able to use all of my men at once. I don't have good artillery platforms. I can't maneuver with my cavalry very well because of these woods. So he is going to disengage on the night of the 7th. And this is really where I contend the Civil War's major turning point happens here. Because instead of withdrawing, as the armies typically do after a big battle, and they'll catch their breath and they'll re-equip and they'll resupply, Grant just goes around Lee and continues on to Spotsylvania Courthouse as he had intended. And so he's going to force Lee to come after him, and Lee's going to intercept him on the outskirts of Spotsylvania Courthouse. And they're going to continue fighting on the morning of May 8th. So serious fighting in the Wilderness on the 5th, the 6th, skirmishing all day on the 7th. There are forest fires that are burning wounded men, just horrific casualties over the course of those few days. And Grant wants to keep going. And so it changes the very nature of how this war is fought. And that's why, I contend it's the turning point, because Grant is going to go for that war of attrition and just start wearing Lee down.
Mm-hmm. And guys, me and Chris did do a Wilderness podcast, and the link will be in the description a few years back. So go and give that a watch and you'll get more information about the actual Wilderness. But again, you're talking about turning points, Chris, and you'll know where this is because it's up the road from you. And it is probably the most important crossroads in America.
Tens of thousands of cars drive through there every day. There's a couple big housing developments through there. And they don't realize just how important that intersection is to American history. And Grant comes into that looking at your PowerPoint on the left-hand slide. He comes down that road. He gets to this intersection, and instead of following the car that's going off toward the right, he's going to bear to the right, turn his horse down the Brock Road and head towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. And his men start cheering wildly. They realize, like, hey, we're not retreating. This is pretty exciting. And morale soars because even though Robert E. Lee has just been pounding away at these guys for a couple of days, They're not giving up. There's no turning back, Grant said.
And again, you mentioned morale there, the Union Army. What's the morale like for the Confederate Army? So, both armies, you just said I know about the Union there, but again, is one better than the other?
Well, the Confederates are feeling like they're hanging on. Nobody's knocked them out of this fight yet. They are starting to look at that election as well. They figure if we can hold on long enough, that election is going to come and Lincoln's going to get voted out of office. And so they've got motivation. They talk about how every bullet they fire is worth a ballot at the voting booth in the fall. And so they know that Robert E. Lee's been leading them to victory up to this point, and Gettysburg, just sort of a minor setback. Nobody has stopped them since then. And so they're really looking forward to optimistically to this spring campaign. So morale in both armies at this point is pretty high. It's interesting that the armies themselves are pretty different. These aren't just the armies that were fighting at Gettysburg the previous July. You've got a lot of conscripts in both armies. The armies have been, reorganized. And so, the animals with which Grant and Lee are fighting are different beasts than they're used to. And that's going to play out over the course of this campaign.
Mm-hmm. What are we looking at number-wise here for both sides?
About 66,000 Confederates, about 120,000 Federals.
Okay, cool.
And don't forget, as Grant's moving this army, he's moving William T. Sherman through Northwest Georgia, heading down toward Atlanta against Joe Johnson. He's got the Red River campaign going on. He has got Franz Sigel moving up the Shenandoah Valley, which is the Confederate breadbasket in Virginia. And he's got Ben Butler moving up the Virginia Peninsula. He'll eventually get bottled up at Bermuda 100. But we've got all these different moving parts to prevent Confederates from using their internal lines to shift troops back and forth. Remember, James Longstreet had been out west since September and has just come back to join Lee just within days of the start of this campaign. Grant doesn't want Confederates to have the ability to shift troops around the map like that. Let's tie them down and let's knock them out.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, let's get on to May the 8th. I know you sort of mentioned it there, and because it's an important part of this, of how this is going to develop, isn't it? So just explain. So it's Todd's Tavern, Laurel Hill, and Cavalry Troubles. Is that right?
Yeah. So as you can see how kind of on the map that you're showing here, the armies are going to start up around this area where you can see sort of the semicircle around Wilderness Tavern, and kind of that's where things start going. But then as Grant pulls out on the night of the 7th, he's going to head down where you can see the dotted road along Brock Road that's heading into that yellow square. Confederates know that something's up. They don't know exactly what, and so their cavalry is going to delay that advance, which allows then Lee to build a road that lets him get out of the wilderness on a parallel track. Lee's going to have twice as far to go, but he's going to march his men down and around. You can see the red dotted line on the map that Darren has for us here. And they're going to circle up and around and try to get in front of Grant before Grant gets into Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now, we should mention the courthouse itself is not all that important. I mean, the building itself isn't important at all. The village is only important because of the road network that's there. That road network is going to give Grant the inside track to Richmond. It's going to give him options for changing his supply base. So it's really kind of the geographic possibilities that the courthouse represents. That's why Grant's trying to get there. Also, the ground around the village itself, just a lot of open areas, open farms, that open field fight that Grant is hoping for. There's that opportunity to try to find that there as well. And so that's kind of what makes Spotsylvania Courthouse important, why Lee's trying to block Grant from getting there. That does create a bottleneck coming down Brock Road. And so as Grant and Lee do clash outside of the village, Grant again can't use his numerical superiority because they're bottled up on that road. He's going to have to send a quarter of his army marching off to the north and east and circle down around the back door. They're not going to really get there until the 9th of May. Three-quarters of the army are going to be bottled up along Brock Road. And so it's going to be a very frustrating day for the Federals on May 8th because they can't get everybody into the fight in order to overwhelm Lee.
hmm Can I just ask, because I know the weather plays a factor later on in this battle, particularly on the battle itself. Is the weather okay at this point, and does that hinder the movement as well on the roads?
It's miserably hot, actually, and these guys talk about it being a sultry morning. Fighting is going to start right outside the courthouse at about 7:45 in the morning. And even in those initial attacks, the soldiers talk about, it being so hot and muggy and humid. They've been marching all night. The march has kicked up dust, so they're just, chalky breath, feeling miserable. And so then the heat just makes it worse throughout the course of the day, and it'll be hot and muggy for the first few days of this battle. George Gordon Meade and Phil Sheridan. Let me ask you, Daz, what is your opinion of George Gordon Meade?
I like George Meade. I like the way he handled things. I think I know he does try and resign when Grant comes over. Um, I don't think he gets enough credit for what he's done or what he did. Sorry. Also throughout the Civil War in general, really. I mean, even at Fredericksburg, he performs really well at Fredericksburg, and he doesn't get the credit.
So George Gordon Meade, the fellow on our left, notoriously bad tempers. Men call him damn goggle-eyed snapping turtle because he usually wears little spectacles. One of his volunteers calls him Old Peppery, which is my favorite of his nicknames, Old Peppery, because he's just got a little spice to him. But I agree with you. He's an underrated performer today, but he earned the position as commander of the Army of the Potomac because all of his peers recognized and respected the great work that he had done as a fighting general, fighting his way up the ranks to earn his promotions. He wins the Battle of Gettysburg, um, settles into stalemate with Robert E. Lee over the course of the winter. Lincoln can't fire the guy who won Gettysburg, particularly because Meade is from Pennsylvania. Gettysburg was in Pennsylvania. He needs Pennsylvania's support to get reelected. So he can't just fire the guy, particularly because he hasn't done anything wrong. So when he promotes Grant to lieutenant general, he Grant supersedes Meade. And Meade says to Grant, you probably want one of your guys in here to do this. I'm glad to offer my resignation for the good of the service. And Grant said that impressed him more than Meade's victory at Gettysburg, and it really demonstrated the sort of professionalism that Meade had. Um, so Meade's going to work under Grant. He gets overshadowed for a lot of different reasons, one of which is the dude on the right side of our screen, Phil Sheridan, one of the most shameless self promoters in the history of the entire United States Army. A guy I don't like because on the 8th of May, as Meade was trying to push his way down the Brock Road, Sheridan's troopers were supposed to clear the way and couldn't. And then they got in the way of the infantry. And then as Meade calls him to task for failing to do his job, and Sheridan even gallivants off. He's not even on the battlefield for part of it. When Meade calls him to task, Sheridan explodes in an act of really what is insubordination. Should get fired for it. But Meade can't fire Sheridan because Sheridan came to this army when Grant came to this army. He's one of Grant's hand-picked guys from the West who's come out to the East to shake things up. So when Meade goes to Grant and tells him, like, here's what your buddy did, he just wants to take the cavalry and he doesn't even want to be here. He wants to take the cavalry off and just try to lure Jeb Stuart into a fight and knock out the Confederate cavalry. And I'm a big Grant fan, but I think here's one of those moments where one of his great strengths is one of his great weaknesses. Grant is loyal to a fault, which serves him really well in a lot of instances. Here it does not, because he backs his buddy Sheridan instead of the army commander. And he says, well, Sheridan generally knows what he's talking about. Cut the orders, let him go. And Sheridan will ride off with more than 12,000 cavalrymen, leaving the Army of the Potomac blind and deaf. They won't have anybody to get intelligence. They'll have nobody to protect their flanks. And Meade will have to grope his way across Spotsylvania and down to the North Anna River, really without any sort of cavalry to serve as his eyes and ears. And that's going to cost thousands of lives. And also Sheridan can go off showboating. He does successfully defeat the Confederate cavalry at a place called Yellow Tavern outside of Richmond on the 11th of May. Jeb Stuart, the commander of the Confederate cavalry, is mortally wounded in that. And so everybody gives Sheridan a free pass. Ooh, Good job, Stewart. But like the raid is a disaster, the rest of it is a disaster. Stewart is easily replaced by equally competent successor, Wade Hampton. So there really is no big win for the Federals, but it's hugely costly because of the fact that Meade has no eyes and ears. And so that's just I just loathe Sheridan for being so irresponsible. And it is, I think, probably one of Grant's lowest points of the whole Overland Campaign. Half of the Union Army now coming onto the field by the end of the 8th. And Warren is the guy who first started the fight, and he's been bottled up. And because he finally feeds enough guys into the fight, that frees up that bottleneck so Sedgwick and the 6th Corps can get on the field, and they're going to file in on Warren's left. As they're doing that, more Confederates are coming onto the field, and they're going to extend their right. And so you'll be able to kind of see where on this map, Gordon comes up past Ewell, behind Kershaw and Rhodes, Johnson. So those are guys that are getting fed in by Lee, and that's going to eventually create the position that we'll talk about in a second called the Mule Shoe Salient. But here you can just see right now it's just basically two roughly parallel lines that are fighting back and forth across the Brock Road. Topography is a huge, huge factor here at Spotsylvania, and that's what's going to cause these lines to start to shift and bend into some weird positions. But what I really like about this map that you're showing us here, Daz, if you look at the Confederate line and you see Anderson off on the left, and he's anchored on the Po River. That's a good secure spot for Lee to have his position. You'll see that there's like a little bend in the Po River by the Confederate left flank. It sort of creates a U. There's going to be a spot where some Federals are going to get trapped in that U, and Confederates are going to have the opportunity to actually trap them there and destroy a part of Grant's army. Those Federals will be able to escape before that happens. But there's some interesting stuff. It's an overlooked part of the battlefield that we can see pretty well here on this map. All the attention really focuses on the Confederate right as more and more of them come in, and it's going to turn into like a big U shape. Ewell has shifted over to the right a little bit in this big U that we talked about. It's a big bulge in the Confederate line. It becomes known as the Mule Shoe Salient because it's shaped like a big horseshoe or mule shoe. So a big semicircular area. And a mule shoe, or a salient, excuse me, is a mule shoe is very useful for mules. A salient is vulnerable because you can attack it from multiple sides at once. You have converging fire against you. Your enemy's fire concentrates on your position, whereas your fire diverges. It fans out over distance, and so it becomes less powerful. And so that's one reason why a salient's just a bad spot to be in. You're also susceptible to crossfire. Now, the scale of this is such that it's probably a poor example, but we can kind of see it. If you are Horatio Wright on the left and you're firing at Ewell, you can also get fired by Burnside on the right if you're Ewell. And so those converging crossfires, you get hit from the front and the back at the same time. So that's another reason why a salient is a vulnerable position. The reason that Lee ends up creating this bulge in the line is because as his troops are rushing onto the field, they're following the ridge lines. I said earlier, topography is a huge factor. The ridge happens to curve up and around and then back down in front of Jubal Early's position. When Lee inspects his line on the 9th of May and he discovers this, he's like, it's probably not a good idea. Like, we should probably go from where Kershaw is on the map just straight over to Early. But if he were to do that, there's some high ground around the Neil McCool farm up by Richard Ewell's name. And Federals could plant their artillery there and blast the Confederate line. And not only straight forward, but kind of blast at an angle down Early's line or down Kershaw's line in what's known as enfilading fire, kind of shooting at them from the side. And that would be a terrible position for Lee to be in. So he's going to decide to leave that bulge, leave that salient in his line to try to deny the Federals from having that high ground at the McCool farm. Now, he does think about this, and as he's going back and forth, he talks to his chief engineer, a guy who has just come from the Western Theater, Martin Luther Smith, who's been involved in the siege around Vicksburg. This is a guy who knows fortifications really well, super talented engineer. And Smith says, I think we can hold this position. We just need some artillery to do it. Lee also talks to Richard Ewell, his second in command, who says, I can hold this line. I just need enough artillery and I can do it. Lee's artillerists are like, yeah, we can hold this line. Just put enough of us there and we can do it. So Lee's going to let this position stand based on all this advice and the contingent factor that there's enough artillery there to hold it. We'll come back to that in a little bit because that's going to be basically the story of Spotsylvania. So Federals continue to come onto the field here to the left, right. Warren, now Hancock is going to come down from Todd's Tavern, a place that you had mentioned earlier. It's about 5 miles on the north, off the left upper corner of the map that you're looking at. Hancock's finally able to come down in the ninth. And Ambrose Burnside swinging down on the right side of our map here, finally able to make it to the battlefield by circumventing that bottleneck and arriving on the morning of the ninth. So now we're seeing forces converging on Lee from two different directions. Lee trying to hunker down and figure out what he's going to do.
And that is the death of this general, which also I think is a little bit underappreciated. Would you say?
Yes and no. I mean, Sedgwick's one of those guys, John Sedgwick. He's super dependable. If you want something done, ask Sedgwick, and he'll get it done. There'll be absolutely no razzle dazzle to it at all. And it might take him a while to do, and it won't be pretty, but he'll get it done. He's dependable, and his men love him. They call him Uncle John. So he's got a lot of pros and cons. He actually goes to the front to try to help sort out some conflict about, where his artillery's deploying and as the infantry's getting onto the field. And, he's right on the front lines. And his staff's like, no, we shouldn't be here. And he's like, we're fine, fine. As this story goes, and it's kind of those famous last words, as he's redirecting his troops, Confederates who are about 600 yards away start taking pot shots at him. And the guys are ducking, and Sedgwick starts laughing. He says, look, they can't hit an elephant at this distance. Guys are still ducking, and he's like, I'm telling you, they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And as soon as he says it that second time, he actually gets shot about an inch and a half below the left eye. Wheels around in mid-sentence, kind of as though he's about to say something, and just collapses on his chief of staff, Martin McMahon. And blood is fountaining from his face. He's basically killed instantly. When Grant gets the news just about an hour later, he has to collect himself. He's not only shocked, but he says, gosh, the loss of Sedgwick is like the loss of a division. 10,000 men. Grant thought that Sedgwick was worth 10,000 men. And again, it wasn't necessarily because Sedgwick was all full of razzle-dazzle, but just because he was so dependable. He was good for morale. He understood Army culture really well. And so it is going to be a big blow. Sedgwick's the highest ranking federal officer killed in the Civil War. And on the 9th of May, I always go out to that monument, which marks the spot of his death, and pay my respects.
Excellent. Yeah, and that is actually my picture, and you took me there one day, a long time ago. Yeah, brilliant.
And we'll have the chance to go back this summer when you come.
We will do, yes. Excellent. Now, okay, so we're at the end of the 9th of May, and so Grant and Lee are sort of set up for what's going to take place. So what are they both thinking at this point? What's going through their mind, do you think?
So Grant is still just looking for ways to exert pressure. He's been stymied. He's frustrated by Warren's piecemeal attacks. So he's going to look for ways to exert pressure all along the line. He's going to send Hancock's guys around the flank into that little U in the Po River that I had mentioned. And you can see here on the map there where it says Barlow. Barlow's division kind of gets stranded over as the rear guard and be involved in some fighting with some of Jubal Early's guys. But Barlow's men will manage to get across and back to safety. Off on the right-hand side, you'll see Ambrose Burnside. We'll talk about him in just a second. As he gets situated and settled in, he's going to extend his line. Grant's going to get a little nervous about Burnside being over there unsupported, and so that's going to play into how successful Burnside can or can't be as a result of this. But the big kind of star attraction out of this day really comes at the center. You can see a little blurb there that says Upton. Emory Upton is a 24-year-old West Point graduate from Batavia, New York, which is kind of up in the area from where me and my family are from. And he's supposed to try to punch through using a new formation. Rather than a long line of battle, he's going to concentrate into a column, punch through like a fist. And as he does that, he's going to peel open a line, and you'll see from the top of the page there, there's a division under Gershom Mott that's supposed to come marching across that open field and into the hole that Upton punches through. And that's going to then split open Lee's line. As this goes on, Warren is supposed to be attacking to hold Anderson in place so Anderson can't shift reinforcements over to help against Upton. Burnside is likewise supposed to attack down the Fredericksburg Road and hold Jubal Early's Third Corps into place. And so with the First Corps and the Third Corps held in place, that punch through in the Second Corps in the middle, it's going to create an opportunity for Grant to then exploit this breakthrough. But Daz, let me ask you, as we're looking at this map, so let's say Upton breaks through, Mott comes in. What do you suppose should happen next?
You would have thought that there would be some support coming up behind them, or on another part of the line, maybe.
So if Burnside holds Early in place and Warren holds Anderson in place, Upton breaks through at Ewell's spot, who's going to help Upton out? Right? And there are no reinforcements that are really in place here. We've got Gershom Mott's one undersized division. He's got about 1,800 men. Ideally, you'd like Wright, who you can see on the federal right there, excuse me, the federal left. You'd like him to be in position to follow up to Upton. I mean, Upton is part of Wright's 6th Corps. That's Sedgwick's replacement. But notice they're not deployed in a position to actually push forward as help. So that's going to be one of the major downsides of this plan. Nobody really kind of thinks about it. It's a new tactic. Nobody's really tried this before. It's going to prove to be incredibly successful. And the Federal Army is not going to know how to capitalize on their own success. So they're not going to be ready to exploit the breakthrough once Upton finally managed it. Now, everything's supposed to start at 5 p.m., but Hancock, because he's embroiled in this mess on the left side of our map, is not able to get back in time to oversee things on that sector of the battlefield. Gouverneur K. Warren, commander of the 5th Corps, has had a couple bad days. He knows the boss is displeased with him, so he's looking for a chance to redeem his reputation. He wants to launch his attack early, so he launches his attack at about 4 o'clock with Grant and Meade's permission. Both of those generals will actually come to the front to watch and see what's going on. Well, that throws off the timetable, so they tell Upton, don't attack at 5 o'clock, wait until 6. We're going to start with an artillery bombardment and soften things up. Then Upton says 5. Nobody tells Gershom Mott that things have been delayed from 5 to 6. And so at 5 o'clock, he dutifully steps across, and you can see on the map that there's an arrow that pushes forward and then circles right back around. That's because as he gets out into that open field, Confederates have nothing else to do, so they start shooting at Mott. And that artillery that Richard Ewell said he needed to hold that position opens fire and blasts Mott off the field. So Upton loses his reinforcements from Mott and doesn't know it. Again, topography, a key feature here. We can't see it on this map, but Upton's men are deployed down in a big punch bowl. So they're down below the soundscape. So all the artillery that's shooting at Mott, Upton's men can't really hear what's going down. Let me have you just back up just a second. I'll get to Upton here in just a second here. But as we're still looking at that map, I do want to talk about Burnside, because notice he's going to launch at 5 p.m. as well, just as he was told to. My eyes are so bad, I can't see if this map says 5 or 6. But he goes at 5 o'clock, and he's supposed to push down the Fredericksburg Road. However, he's supposed to keep his right flank attached to the Nye River for protection. You can see where it's attached on the earthworks. This map doesn't necessarily show how Burnside carries this out. It looks like he just plows straight down the line, but in fact, he does what's called a left wheel. So he keeps his right side attached to the Nye River, and he turns in a big semicircular advance. So that's how you end up with this diagonal of a set of earthworks that are right there. So think about like the ticking hand of a clock swinging forward over an arc. That's how Burnside pushes forward. And he gets almost to the edge of the village. You can see where those little red arrows are that point out from Wilcox. Burnside gets down into that area. And it's only that once Grant's like, Burnside's unprotected, he's kind of vulnerable, and he orders Burnside to pull back. And so Burnside will pull back and he'll dig in, and that's when those earthworks that we're seeing here actually get constructed. And so Burnside gets all the way to the edge of the village. He has the most success of anybody at Spotsylvania. Everybody forgets about that. And then Grant is the one with the cold feet who orders him to back off. So Warren goes early. Mott goes on time and is repulsed. Burnside goes on time and then gets withdrawn. But that means when Upton finally goes at 6, he's lost his help from Burnside. He's lost his help from Warren. He's lost his help from Mott. And he'll finally go forward at about 6:10 after that artillery bombardment that starts at 6. Now, Daz, if you want to kind of push forward
Yeah.
here.
And just before we do
Yeah,
that,
sure.
can I just say, so when you look at that road network there, Burnside was successful in breaking through to the village and going up the Brock Road. They could have come up behind the Confederate army then.
Yes. Can you see how unprotected Lee's
Hmm.
right flank is? He does have
Yeah.
some cavalry. He didn't send all his cavalry off with Jeb Stuart. He still has Wade Hampton's entire division here, and Hampton's operating in that area on the right flank. So there's some, protection there. But if Burnside gets into the village against Wilcox, he's in the rear of the entire Confederate line. So the implications there are pretty huge.
Yeah.
I'll also mention, since we're still looking at the map here, if you look where Burnside is across the road between his name and Nye River, is where my wife's family's property is, Stevenson Ridge, where Emerging Civil War holds its annual symposium. So those earthworks that we're seeing there actually are on property that my wife's family owns. My wife has very nice earthworks, I assure you.
I was going to ask you about that later. But yeah, let's move on to this now. So this again is when we went out in December 2021 to the site of, and this is where the Sixth Corps and Henry Upton came onto the battlefield from, isn't it?
Yep. And you can see the monument there that marks kind of where his strike force launches from. He's got 12 regiments organized in 4 rows of 3 regiments each. Their alignment is actually marked on the back there. So those 12 regiments, he's got about 6,000 guys that are going to punch forward in a fist, handpicked. When Upton sees these men he's going to command, he's like, of course, who can beat these guys? Confederates won't be able to stop these guys. He's very excited to lead these guys, including his own 121st New York, which is in the front right of the attack formation. The idea here is speed, and so he does not want his men to put the percussion caps on their rifles when they're in the front rank. He doesn't want them to be tempted to stop and fire back. Run across this field as fast as you can, jump into the Confederate works, and start stabbing with your bayonet. That's the plan. And then if you have a second, you can put your percussion cap on and open fire if you need to. So these guys are going to charge across this field. Confederates don't see them coming because their pickets have been cleared away. It's not until Upton's men are coming across this field that the Confederates are like, oh, here they come, boys. Watch out. Confederates are able to get 2, maybe 3 shots off before Upton's men are in the works. And it really does turn into just an absolute fierce melee, hand-to-hand combat. Upton's men do peel open that section of the line as intended. And then Upton's like, all right, I need some help. And he turns for reinforcements, and there aren't any. He's supposed to have 3 regiments of Vermonters as his own reserves. They got so excited they've run into the fight already. Their enthusiasm has carried him into the brawl. And he's got nobody. No Gershom Mott coming from, in this picture, coming from the left, coming from the north. Mott's already been repulsed. And there's nobody else to help exploit this breakthrough. Now, Upton was told that this is basically a suicide mission, and if you break through, you're going to get promoted to brigadier general. But if you don't come back. Well, he's broken through. He's done what he said he would do. And there's no help. And so his men will eventually get driven out of those works. Richard Ewell will rally men, and they'll plug that gap. Because Warren launched his attack early, Lee's able to shift some reinforcements from that direction to help stem this tide, and that's really what's going to turn the tide of Battle Hill. There are going to be some Federals who are going to come from the tip of the mule shoe, who should be tied down by Gershom Mott, but are not. They're going to be able to flood in as reinforcements, and that's what's going to drive Upton back out of the Confederate works. Upton's going to be grievously disappointed. He'll be depressed. It was all for naught. He did what he was supposed to. His success was not supported. He feels almost despondent at the senseless loss of life. That he had the success and it achieved nothing. But Grant, and this is one of the things I like about him, he looks at this and he's like, "Oh, well, we should have done something about that." And he learns the lesson. Like, all right, well, let's try this again because it did work. Upton did what he said he would do, and we just weren't ready to help him out. Let's make sure we're ready next time. And so he's going to put into motion a plan to replicate Upton's attack on a larger scale. And he's going to use Hancock's entire Second Corps to be that fist, instead of just 6,000 guys from 12 regiments. And he's going to punch through the Confederate position right at the very tip of that salient. We can see Hancock's Second Corps here pushing in. But this time, Grant's going to make sure there are reinforcements. Wright's Sixth Corps is going to be positioned to flood into the breakthrough and exploit any advantage that Hancock is able to create. So, Grant is going to learn his lessons. He's going to do what he can to improve upon the plan, and he's going to re-execute on the 12th. Another, I think perhaps the key decision Lee makes here that's going to be catastrophic. Notice that Hancock's at the top of this map. He'd been over on the left side of these maps, over in the Po River, remember? And now, to get to position, he's got to march up and around to get to the top of the map. As he's doing that, we've got Burnside moving around off on the right side of the map. And as Lee's trying to figure out what's going on, I was liking it to like trying to read the tea leaves. He sees all this movement kind of shifting around toward his right. And what did Grant do at the Wilderness? He shifted around Lee's right and just marched down to Spotsylvania. So Lee starts thinking, I think Grant's pulling out and shifting around me again. So he's going to try to get his army ready to get the jump on Grant and block him again. That becomes all the more important because on the 11th it starts to rain and it's going to turn these roads to mush. So Lee's going to pull his artillery out of the mule shoe because the rain would impede their movement. He wants to get them moving, get the head start because it's the slowest part of the army. So get them out of there. And nobody tells the division commander who's in charge down there, a guy named Edward Allegheny Johnson. And Johnson goes to Ewell and he's like, "What's going on with my artillery?" And Ewell's like, "Oh, yeah, about that." Finally, they send word to Lee. It's like, maybe we need to have that artillery after all. Because remember, Ewell said he could only hold this position if he had the artillery to do it. And Lee has pulled the artillery out. Okay? Ewell proved on the 10th, when Mott was attacking, that artillery is enough to repulse Mott. I can hold this if I've got the artillery. He proves it against Gershom Mott. And now that artillery's gone, even as Hancock is getting into position to launch an attack against that very spot. So what's going to happen is Grant's going to use Hancock to push right through like that giant fist again. Burnside is supposed to push against the east face of the salient to hold Confederates in position so they can't shift as reinforcements and maybe even have a breakthrough of their own. Warren is supposed to attack against Anderson's corps on the eastern side, or excuse me, the western side of the Confederate line. Warren's men have attacked there throughout the 8th. Again, skirmishing on the 9th. Big attacks there on the 10th. These are men who do not have the appetite to charge against the same Confederate lines across over the same fields yet again. And so Warren's going to have very tepid assaults, so much so that Grant orders Meade to relieve him if Ward doesn't step it up. And Warren eventually will he'll get off the hook at this point, but it really does spoil Grant on Warren, basically for the rest of Warren's career. Hancock's going to launch his attack at about 4:30 in the morning, waiting for the light to just offer some sort of ability to see. It's really foggy. It's raining. He can't see. So he's just waiting for a little bit of daylight. He pushes through. He does break through. He's going to peel open about a half a mile opening in Lee's line. Wright's Sixth Corps is going to flood into the breach as reinforcements, but Lee is going to be able to react and send reinforcements of his own in to try to close this up. And really, from the start of this attack at about 4:30 in the morning to when Lee finally pulls out the last of his men, this is going to be a fight that's going to last for 22 straight hours. The most sustained hand-to-hand combat of the entire Civil War. Once Lee starts feeding reinforcements back into the breach to try to recapture ground that Hancock has captured, it's just going to be stubborn fighting, hand to hand, in the most horrific hand to hand fighting of the entire Civil War. Daz, you've walked out on that ground. That's the area
Yeah, so I'm
behind
going
you
to
in
bring up
the
some
photo.
pictures now of
Yeah.
the ground, because again, this won't do it justice for people watching.
This
Um,
is looking up from the direction where Sam McGowan's men are going to come in as part of those reinforcements. They're going to have to push their way up this hill, even as Wright's Sixth Corps reinforcements are going to come flooding up over the hill in the opposite direction. So you can kind of see there's a monument, a couple monuments up there. Between those monuments and these trees that we see in the foreground, those trees weren't there at the time, but that's really going to end up being the epicenter as these two forces begin to converge on each other.
yeah, and again, you until you stand there, and you know this, Chris, because you've stood there many times, you just don't realise how that ground is just. It's got so many kinks, and I mean, it's even got a swale, hasn't it? Again, unless you stand there, you will never understand it.
And the swale is the most important feature of this, I would say, this whole battlefield, but certainly of this particular fight. Federals are going to be coming from that tree line on the far left straight across the field, or at least they should be coming straight across the field to the Confederate position, which would be just off the camera on the right. But that swale cuts diagonally across the field. And as Wright's men flood out of that tree line and into the swale, they want to take advantage of the protection that the swale offers. And so they stay in that cover rather than coming rushing up straight left to right. They get in that swale and it starts funneling them diagonally toward the camera. And so these guys start coming up out of the swale about that same spot where McGowan's men were pushing from behind the camera in this direction at the same time. So here's just a different picture. There's that swale. You can kind of see it here a little more off to the right-hand side of the screen. It's the same picture that's behind me. So over here, oh, I'm losing my hand in the
Mhm.
background here, but off in this direction here, the swale's kind of coming forward that direction.
And this is the last one. So this is a view from the Federals' point of view. Is that right?
So this we're looking at the Federals would be coming from that tree line.
Oh
They should be
yes.
going
Yep.
straight left to right, but instead they come down into that swale, and that swale is going to start pushing them
And
up in the
obviously,
direction of the camera.
I know you mentioned that 22-hour hand fighting. Here's an amazing lithograph painting or picture or whatever you want to call it of that scene. Um, but they literally just turn into demons, don't they? At this point.
John Haley of the 17th Maine actually describes men. He says men are not as men, but as demons, to use the word that you say there. This is, the most famous image that's been created of the Bloody Angle. I don't know how you really capture it on canvas. So maybe that's just why artists haven't tried, because it just becomes the most inhuman sort of thing. The pouring rain, mud up to their knees. They're shooting each other at point blank range, using their rifles as stabbing each other with their bayonets, using their rifles as spears, as clubs. They've got camp hatchets, knives, rocks, sticks, fists, anything, and it just becomes this, as one soldier says, a saturnalia of blood. And Meade and Grant keep feeding reinforcements in here, trying to find some way to dislodge the Federals who were able to dislodge the Confederates, who were able to bottleneck the Federals up at the works themselves. And Lee is not trying to recapture this position. He's just trying to hold the Federals off so he can create a fallback position. We talked about, should he let that big U stay or should he just seal off the end? And he's going to decide to seal off the end, but he needs time to do it. And so he's going to trade the lives of his men to save the life of his army. He's going to buy time with lives and create that fallback position. So he keeps throwing reinforcements into this fight, not trying to regain the line, but just to buy time. It's going to be about 2 o'clock in the morning on May 13th when Lee will send word to his guys to finally start falling back. And in twos and threes, they'll drift away and take up position in that new last line. Federals realize something's up. They're going to push in, capture the last couple hundred Confederate defenders, begin to advance after Lee's retreating men, and Confederate artillery will discourage that pursuit and force Grant's men back to the outside of these works that we're looking at. Pouring rain the whole time, and it's just a scene of devastation these men have not ever seen before. I mean, the carpet of blue bodies across the field in front of that works, it's just stunning, the carnage that's here. There's going to be about 9,000 Federal casualties in this fight, about 8,000 Confederate casualties. Guys that are so shot up they don't look like bodies anymore. Wounded men that are entangled in the bodies that are trampled into the mud and they can't pull themselves out, and they drowned in the water that's collecting in these works. Some are smothered in the mud. It's just absolutely devastating. On the left here, Derek is showing us a picture of a stump that's in the Smithsonian Institute. That was a 22-inch oak tree that stood where that concrete marker is. It marks the spot out there on the battlefield of that oak tree. And it was shot down by bullets over the course of the battle. And I invite everybody to think about this. How much soft lead does it take to chop down 22 inches of hard oak? Yeah, and that's pretty amazing. Other trees also were shot down by lead. This is the most famous one. After the war, soldiers actually will grab the stump on their way to the Grand Review in Washington, and they'll take the stump with them, and it becomes part of the Smithsonian's collection. You can still see it today. It's a stunning artifact to the devastation down there.
And again, that is one of the things that's always stuck in my mind about this battle is just this, crazy. Okay, so the battle comes to its end on the 12th. There is an incident with Robert Lee, isn't there? Another Lee to the rear incident. But what's his thinking here as far as counter-attacking is concerned? What's he thinking?
Yeah, Lee's pretty desperate at this point. He's the indispensable man of the Confederacy. He doesn't really have anybody he trusts to fill the breach. On the the second day of the Wilderness, he's going to try to lead some of Longstreet's men into the fight in a counterattack. They refuse to go forward. It's the Texas Brigade. They start shouting out, "Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear. We won't go forward unless General Lee goes to the rear." And he'll find someone else to lead them into fight there. But on the 10th of May, when Upton breaks through at Ewell's position, again, Lee will try to lead men into the fight, and they'll cry out, "Lee to the rear." On the 12th, on the morning of the 12th, in the fight of the Muleshoe, again, he will try to lead Confederates into the fight. John Brown Gordon will lead the counterattacks instead, after the men cry out, "Lee to the rear." Part of it is he just doesn't feel like he can trust his subordinates. I don't think that was the case in the Wilderness because James Longstreet was showing up, and Longstreet was Lee's old war horse, someone he depended on. But Lee doesn't have a lot of confidence, that same level of confidence in Richard Ewell. And in fact, Lee finds Ewell on the morning of the 12th, and Lee is just having a complete spaz out fit, yelling at his men, losing his temper, calling them cowards, swearing at them. And Lee very calmly, very coolly rides up, and he says, "General Ewell, how do you propose to control your men if you cannot control yourself?" and he gives Ewell a timeout. And that's when Gordon will kind of step into that role and lead some of those counterattacks. Everybody knows that if Lee gets shot, game over. There's nobody who can take this army over. Ewell would be the second in command at this point. He's not capable of it. Longstreet, perhaps, but he got accidentally wounded by his own men in the wilderness, and so he's not available to do it. Jubal Early, A.P. Hill, who's out sick during this battle. It's just there aren't any options. It's Lee or nothing. And so game over if something happens to him. So the stakes are really high for Lee personally in this moment.
And they don't just leave the battlefield at this point, do they? There is a continuation. So there is, a bit of a stalemate that happens between the 13th and is it the 16th?
Yeah, so Grant's not done. I mean, the battle for the Mule Shoe's over, but the Battle of Spotsylvania is not. There's a whole nother week of fighting. Grant's going to shift around toward that Fredericksburg front, the front of the Fredericksburg Road. Capturing that road when Burnside got there is a huge operational advantage because it allows Grant to shorten his supply lines. It's going to offer that opportunity to advance on Richmond. But Grant's going to look for a way to shift his army around and still try to get at Lee. And so we'll see a big shift in the fighting here. It's raining, so Grant's army doesn't move as fast as he wants it to, so they miss a couple opportunities. Lee is exhausted. He actually misses an opportunity as well. So if Grant had successfully executed the maneuver that you're looking at right here, Lee was unprepared and unconvinced that Grant was moving. So Lee makes a mistake. Grant makes a mistake. The weather's working against him. It becomes really problematic over the course of the next few days. Grant's going to just keep looking for opportunities to probe and poke. There are going to be some smaller skirmishes, some fighting with some cavalry off this map where the United States colored troops get involved with a fight against the Army of Northern Virginia for the first time. Not until the 18th of May that things dry up enough for Grant to try another major assault across the same ground they assaulted during the battle against the Mule Shoe. And Hancock's men are going to push down across that very same ground, supported by some of Wright's men. Fortunately, Wright is supposed to attack with his whole corps, and only one of his 3 divisions gets into position in time. And so it's going to be an underwhelming attack, infantry-wise, but also by this point, Lee's had 5 days to fortify, and so he's going to have the strongest set of earthworks he's ever had in the war at this point. And so these big arrows that you see at the top of the page pushing down toward the Confederate line, they won't even be able to get within rifle range because Lee's artillery is so dominant on this field. So this attack's going to last for about 3 hours, and then Grant's going to call it off. He's not going to go through that same sort of slaughter that things went through on the 12th. And instead, he's going to shift all these guys back over to the right. So you can see Wright at the top of the map, but you can also see him down on the lower right. Those men are going to make those marches. It's going to continue to wear down Grant's army. We talked about this war of attrition. That goes both ways. Grant's army's also getting chewed up. They're getting exhausted. They're fighting, marching, often, for 2 or 3 days at a time without a chance to rest. So that's going to really affect their fighting capability and quality as this campaign continues. Mm-hmm. Finally, there's going to be the opportunity for Grant to just pull out. If this doesn't work, and so by the afternoon of the 18th, he decides, you know what, we're going to head around Lee and move south again. And he sets that to begin the night of the 19th. But before that can happen, Lee is going to attack Grant's supply line at a place called Harris Farm. This is behind Grant's line. Richard Ewell's going to make a big swinging arc up and around, hit Grant's supply lines, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth fighting, and literally there are Federal troops marching onto the battlefield along that same supply route, and so the Confederates are going to find themselves pretty quickly overwhelmed. Even though these Confederates are grizzled veterans of the Second Corps, they're just no match for the sheer weight of numbers. And so, even though these heavy artillery units that they face are green troops, they've been in the Washington defenses for most of the war. They've come down, literally marched onto the battlefield the day before that morning. The regiments are huge. They've got 1,800 guys, and they're used to, the training they got on dress parades. They will stand in the open and try to slug it out with these Confederate veterans who called it one of the bravest things they've ever seen. They can't believe the Federals are just standing out there taking it. They suffer huge casualties, but the sheer weight of numbers, as I said, pins the Confederates there. And then more Federal reinforcements come, veterans from other parts of the Army. And Ewell is barely able to hang on till dark, and he's able to escape only because darkness falls.
It's a very accessible battlefield, isn't it, Chris? So it's easy to visit, and there's lots of trails, isn't there?
It is, and it's. I urge people to go out there. I mean, it's really, uh, depending on exactly how you're counting, it's the third or fourth bloodiest fight of the entire Civil War. And a lot of people don't know that much about Spotsylvania. And it's a beautiful spot. You can get out there, and it's just bucolic. And it's hard to imagine that things were just so horrific there once upon a time. To me, I love the sublimeness of that juxtaposition. And I urge people to go and explore it for themselves. You'd also shown a picture a second ago of dead Confederates from Harris Farm. It's one of the few places where we actually have bodies of casualties on the battlefield during this entire campaign. These were captured on the morning, these pictures were captured on the morning of the 20th by Timothy O'Sullivan. And you can really zoom in and look at these people who are just like you and me, Daz. And it's just a shocking reminder of the humanity of war. So explore the battlefield and explore these photos. And I think you can really take away a lot from Spotsylvania that you can't from other parts of the Overland Campaign.
Yeah, and that was the point of these, is the horror that happens there. And just before we wrap up here, again, a little shout out to Stevenson's Ridge, because there it is, the event centre with grant stores and Works and all that goes with it. The symposium, of course, takes place there every year, and 10th anniversary coming up this year.
That's right. Yep. It's and it's remarkable that part of the battlefield, it's never been formally preserved. It's where Ambrose Burnside was. Nobody cares about Ambrose Burnside, so they never bothered saving the battlefield. A lot of great Civil War history on that side of the battlefield in particular, and so really, it's a real privilege to be able to be attached to that story and through my family and my wife's family, and it's a real privilege.
Yeah, and this is important because you and Chris White wrote a immersive war series book. So guys, go and find this. It's fantastic. It's as we like to say, a gateway drug into the Civil War history. Immersive Civil War series books. So was that enjoyable writing that one, Chris?
I did. Well, I mean, as enjoyable as any of this is, the writing itself is enjoyable. The story, of course, is
not
harrowing. And then just as a tease for your listeners and viewers, I've got a full-length battle study coming out. There we go, A Tempest of Iron and Lead, that'll be out later this summer. It's 111,000 words, so much more substantial than the paperback. And looking forward to getting that out there.
Awesome. And all that's left to say is Chris did an amazing talk at the American Civil War Roundtable UK Spring Conference last year, which is on our YouTube, on their YouTube channel, and I'll leave a link for that. But all that is left to say is, Chris, thank you very much.
My privilege. Thanks for having me, Daz. Always fun.
Cheers.